People got bored of Elden Ring and they went over to Zelda. Tears of the Kingdom is infinitely better than Elden Ring. The enemy models aren't good, the AI isn't good, the level design isn't good, the structure isn't good. The first flame is finally dying out.
What's up, everybody? Today we'll be tearing apart a Nintendo fanboy that has some outlandish claims about Elden Ring. The first gem we'll be reviewing is The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom is more popular and talked about than Elden Ring. Now, you might ask yourself, why does it look like he's taking a shit in every single thumbnail? Is because he is. The turd is the video. And the second video we'll take a look at is Souls-likes indie games have long surpassed FromSoft's tired formula. So I just want to warn you guys, it's about to get cringe. Let's get started.
The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom is a year old, and it's being talked about more than the upcoming Elden Ring DLC. The Elden Ring DLC actually got overshadowed by Tifa's titties in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, right? Tifa's titties got more views on YouTube than the Elden Ring DLC did. And don't try and deny it. Don't try and say, well, actually the Elden Ring trailer was reacted to several times by YouTubers that nobody cares, but nobody cares about that. Nobody cares about the views in general. I'm not sitting here saying that Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is bigger than Elden Ring or something. My point is that views on YouTube don't matter at all, right? Tifa's titties overshadowed the Elden Ring DLC trailer because Tifa's titties are actually nice to look at. They actually look like they belong. They could be in real life, right? It looks like you can almost reach out and touch them.
So right off the bat, I call bullshit because there's no way this Nintendo fanboys know what real titties look like. But that's besides the point. I'm going to skip the titty part because he talks about it for quite some time.
I did not give a shit about the Elden Ring DLC. And the reason for that being is that it wasn't relevant, right? This is the interesting thing about Elden Ring, is that I do think the majority of the audience only bought it out of hype. They only bought it because it was the new big thing. It was being backed by George R. R. Martin. It had a major ad campaign behind it. There was this major shill campaign behind the Elden Ring, right? People were legit stoked for it. And then it came out, it was disappointing. Millions of people walked away thinking that wow, that was it. It wasn't my kind of game, but whatever. And a lot of those people never even beat it. And I ask you, how many people who did not beat Elden Ring are going to go out and play the DLC?
So this is going to be his first and last good point. I don't think that people that didn't complete the main game, lost interest, or thought it was too hard are going to purchase and beat the DLC for the simple reason that it's endgame content and you need to beat Moog to even get there. So those people will probably not buy it. But everybody else, on the other hand, is extremely stoked. And we're about to find out just what percentage that truly is. First, let's listen to his numbers, his evaluation on how many people beat the game.
No one, right? The DLC for Elden Ring, from FromSoft games have traditionally been very well received, but they don't necessarily bring in a new player base, right? Because they're essentially made for people who, the kind of person who does everything else in the base game, which is a very small niche portion of the gaming population, right? Nobody is going to go through all of the Elden Ring DLC if they haven't actually beaten the game. Why would they do that? That doesn't make any sense. It's a complete waste of money. It's a complete waste of time. There's no reason to buy the expansion if you never even finished the base game. And I think it's safe to say that the majority member of the something like 90% of the gaming audience who bought into the Elden Ring hype, probably more like 95 if we're being generous, 95% of the gaming population, they never finished the game. They never beat the first boss. They never figured out what they were supposed to do. They never got into the game.
Alright, so now we know that this fanboy is talking right out of his asshole because 40% of the players beat Horaloo. And if you beat Horaloo, you're pretty much done the game. You only have one more boss left. And when he says that 95% of the players didn't beat the first boss, that is just ludicrous because obviously over 72% of the players beat Margit. I mean, it's not that hard. And if you buy the game, you're probably going to give it a shot. Now, of course, 28% dropped and didn't beat Margit, but that is to be expected. It is a Souls games after all.
And as a result of that, they're not going to be interested in the DLC. And what has that led to, right? People got bored of Elden Ring and they went over to Zelda. And people realized that, like, wow, Zelda is a lot more fun, right? You can do a lot more stuff. Like, there's this cool building. There are these like cool areas to explore. Like, it has a better plot. More interesting characters, mechanics. Whoa, I can fly around in circles around a mountain and like fight a giant dragon. Like Tears of the Kingdom is infinitely better than Elden Ring. And the only reason you would ever think otherwise is if you hadn't played Tears of the Kingdom, right? That was kind of the gist of it, right? But over the past year, as people like slowly started accepting that Tears of the Kingdom was a great game, like people are slowly beginning to talk about like how great it was. Its amazing moments, the Master Sword pull, the dive at the end, like this and that, and just like all these phenomenal things that just made Tears of the Kingdom what it is, right? Like there's so much about Tears of the Kingdom though, which I would argue makes it like one of the best games ever made, right? Just like Breath of the Wild before it. But
Personally, I think Tears of the Kingdom was good. It was definitely not the best game ever made, and it was definitely not the best Zelda game ever made. I prefer the old school ones by far. It was a lot of fun to experiment with the Ultra Hand mechanic, but calling it the best game of all time would be an extreme stretch, even for this guy.
right now we're in this like weird phase of denial from like the Pretendos and like the FromSoft fanboys is that they don't want to admit it's true, right? They don't want to admit that like Dark Souls isn't appealing to everyone and that it's kind of a niche thing. They kind of do this thing where like they assume if that you're not into Dark Souls that you just haven't been initiated yet, that you've just been like filtered, that you just don't know how to play the game or whatever. No, like I've played through Dark Souls. I don't enjoy it, right? Like that's the reality. Like that kind of thing is like sacrilegious to them. Like admitting that you've beaten Dark Souls and then just going like, yeah, I didn't enjoy it. Like that is like the craziest thing they can possibly hear, right? Like to them, like Dark Souls is like the only game you should play, right? And the reality is that if you ever actually like go outside that bubble, if you play games like Ys or Zelda or like anything, like you're gonna find like a treasure trove of better games out there. It's shocking how desperate the FromSlop fans are to try to keep Elden Ring relevant.
To think that From Software needs the fans to keep the hype alive is ridiculous. I mean, the trailer got around 10 million views, and that's just on one YouTube channel, not even counting GameSpot and all the other reposters. And then there's the YouTubers that were reviewing live. I think Ziostorm had like 4,000 live viewers watching, Ratatosker had 3,000. It was just a crazy event. And there's so much hype around it that they decide to not even go at the Game Awards and just announce it 2 months later on their YouTube channel, and it did just fine. I mean, Elden Ring sold 23 million copies. I'm sure the DLC is going to sell at least half of that. So, yeah, this guy's in straight denial. Even more than denial, I think it's a little bit of projection as well, because even Ratatosker made a video about 5 months ago how even the Zelda YouTubers were not interested in the lore. They weren't talking about it because there was just not much to talk about. Everything was self-explained and the lore wasn't interesting. Like the Tears of the Kingdom, it fell out of relevancy extremely quickly, especially since there's no DLC for it, unlike Breath of the Wild, and they kind of have just moved on. So when it comes to relevancy, it's pretty much at the bottom right now.
2024, right? It's one of those situations where you're just kind of like feeling bad for them because they gaslit themselves into thinking this was like one of the best games of 2022. They gaslit themselves into thinking this was one of the best games ever made. Like they legit thought this was going to beat out Zelda. This is going to be more popular than Tears of the Kingdom, but it's not. It isn't. It never will be. And that fact becomes more and more obvious with each passing year, right? Not only are people talking about like Tears of the Kingdom, they're talking about older Zelda games, right? Like people are getting into like the Oracle games and like Ocarina. We're in that age now where people who grew up with Wind Waker and Twilight Princess are trying to tell us that those games were like misunderstood masterpieces and that like the new ones have lost the series identity, right? Like we're in that era now. Like we're in that phase where like the people who grew up with those games are like trying to attack the old ones, just like how the old audience used to attack Ocarina and like the new wave of games, right? Like history repeats itself in this regard. But I think this time we hardcore fans like understand, like people who have been around the block a few times, like we know how to handle this stuff, right? Like we know like these guys are just fanboys who are blinded by nostalgia, who don't.
So I guess I'm a fanboy blinded by nostalgia because when I first played Breath of the Wild and I went into the first dungeon, which are the sacred beasts, I believe, and I was extremely disappointed at how simple it was and how quick it was done. It really didn't match the level that you would expect from a Zelda game. I do hope that Nintendo gets back to a traditional Zelda game next. I guess time will tell. Like, yeah, the open world is fun, but that's not why you buy a Zelda game. Anyways, let's keep listening to this clown.
You're gonna have to compete with like the most successful fantasy video game franchise ever, and that just isn't gonna happen. Witcher 3 couldn't do it, Dark Cloud couldn't do it, like Skyrim couldn't do it, right? You really believe that Elden Ring is going to be more relevant than Zelda 20 years from now? No, it's not gonna happen. It's already been dead, buried, and forgotten, right? Just like Game of Thrones, just like George R. R. Martin, just like Dark Souls. The first flame is finally dying out on your irrelevant video game development studio.
So yeah, the level of salt that's coming out of this guy is unreal. He should really check his blood pressure because I'm concerned for his health with this amount of salt. Now, before we watch the second video, you guys might ask yourself, Josh, why even give this clown the time of day? Clearly, he's a rage baiter. He's just trying to get some hate clicks. But I think this guy's pretty consistent across his entire channel. He's just that much of a Nintendo fanboy. And that's the type of content I enjoy doing. I love tearing apart fanboys because their salt, it's just mwah, chef kiss. Absolutely hilarious. And I really enjoy it. Let's watch the second video.
Pre-order my upcoming novel, American Evil, in the description below. So with the release of Another Crab's Treasure, it seems like Nintendo Switch has an indie darling on its hands. I haven't seen a lot of gameplay from it, but like it seems like a lot of people I know are very enthusiastic about the game and want to support it. And I myself wasn't interested in it when I saw it, but something about it has really caught my attention, right? Something about it has really made me think. And I've talked about this before, but I do think it bears repeating now, before I even played the game. Like, isn't it interesting how we're getting so many Souls-like clones from these indie developers that are objectively better than the real thing, right? Salt and Sanctuary was better. Hollow Knight was better. And I'm sure Another Crab's Treasure is better.
Wow, there's a lot to unpack here. First of all, he's claiming that Another Crab's Treasure is like a win for Nintendo somehow. That game is multi-platform, so it's a win for everybody, especially gamers in general. That game is fucking amazing, there's no doubt about it. Is it better than a FromSoft game? No, it's not. Let's just stop fucking around. It's not. And for him to say that Salt and Sanctuary is better than a FromSoft game, like that's just pure cope. It sounds like he's just naming all the Souls-likes that are available on Switch and just calling them better because he's simping for the little plastic box.
Right. The reality is, unlike Zelda, which is so complex and involved that like it's very difficult for people to copycat it, Dark Souls is relatively simple, right? Dark Souls is very basic, where you have like basic enemies just standing around waiting for you, and then they'll come at you and they'll attack you with like their one or two attacks. right? That's Dark Souls, right? The enemy models aren't good, the AI isn't good, the level design isn't good, the structure isn't good, like the pacing isn't good. Like Dark Souls is just a mess, like fundamentally. So it isn't hard to take what people like about Dark Souls, right, and apply it to other better games, right? Salt and Sanctuary is a really good example where it is a 2D action Dark Souls like, a Metroidvania essentially that has better combat, better bosses, better mechanics than Dark Souls, in spite of like being essentially the same thing, like structure wise and tone wise. Like Salt and Sanctuary really builds off the Dark Souls in a really compelling, interesting way. And then, of course, you have Hollow Knight, which takes a lot of the concepts from Dark Souls and applies it to a more Metroidvania concept, which makes it better, like in general, right? The character balancing is better, the level up system is better, like the game is more intuitive, it's more fun to play, right? It has a more interesting plot, like characters, right? Like, Hollow Knight is objectively better than Dark Souls. And another Krebs Treasure, although I have not played it, is really interesting to me because by the looks of it, the game has a bright, colorful aesthetic. It has, unique characters, a unique setting, unique gameplay. Like the way it looks is that like it is very different from Dark Souls while still retaining like the same amount of like the same general gameplay loop. So, what are the chances that that game is better than Dark Souls as well? Right? Like my point is, I don't think it's I think considering the sheer amount of like indie games we've gotten, like imitating Dark Souls, like I don't think it's impossible to say that like it's not going to be too much longer until we get an indie studio that makes better Dark Souls games than FromSoft.
But then he said maybe in the future it looks like we'll have game developers that pump out better Souls games than From Slop. So it's like, which is it? Are they already better than From Software games, or are they going to be better? This guy is just making so little sense. It's like he's not even trying to be rational. And as for games that are on the same footing as an Elden Ring or a Dark Souls or Bloodborne, there's not that many. I mean, the only one that kind of comes close, in my opinion, is Lies of P. That is a solid Souls-like. And some people really like the Neo series to the point where they would put it on the same footing. Personally, I don't. I think Lies of P is the closest. When they announced the new Lords of the Fallen, the developers were saying this is basically Dark Souls 4, and in my opinion, it fell flat. There's just something not quite right. It is a good game, but it's definitely not Dark Souls 4. So his statement, as usual, is just completely wrong.
Right? Like I don't think it's that far away because we're already kind of seeing like the beginnings of that. We're seeing like people do new and interesting things with the idea, things that like from Slop would never be able to think of, right? Would they be able to come up with the crab thing? No. Would they be able to come up with the Hollow Knight thing? No. Would be able to come up with Salt and Sanctuary? No. Right? Like they don't have the skill or the talent to innovate on their own idea. All they can do is just do the same thing over and over and over and over and over and over again while other studios do it better on Nintendo hardware, right? That is, I think, the inevitable fate of Dark Souls is that it's just going to be slowly eclipsed by all the games that are copycatting it to the point where I hope we finally come up with a better name for the genre than Souls like. Like come on, bro. Like so it's it's an action RPG. Come up with like a better term. Like it's just I'm um just not a fan of the terminology. Like Dark Souls, I think, has kind of proven itself to not all be that like innovative or all that long lasting. Like who do you know who even remembers the original Dark Souls at this point? Right, we are at that point now where I think the game is like slowly being forgotten by the masses, which is a really interesting thing to see happen, considering just how long people spent like shilling it as like this innovative and innovator in game design. But
That's just incredibly wrong. I mean, there's millions of new Souls-likes players that were brought in with Elden Ring, and a lot of these people, after beating Elden Ring, went to go try the games that preceded it, and then they tried Demon Souls, Dark Souls, Bloodborne, Sekiro. I know a lot of people who were hooked in with Elden Ring, and then they played the entire catalog, because that's usually what happens with From Software games. My first Souls-like was Dark Souls 2, and once I beat it, I played every single other Souls-likes that was available at the time. And when the Demon Souls remake was announced on PS5, I was really excited because finally I could play the last Souls-like I hadn't played yet. So once again, this guy is just talking out of his ass.
Yeah, my point is, I think there are better games than Souls out there already, right? Like we don't even have to like bring in like Tears of the Kingdom to prove that, right? Like I don't even have to talk about Breath of the Wild, right? I don't have to talk about like all the better Nintendo games, right? Like there are better games from smaller studios than FromSlop that are doing the same thing that they're doing, but better. And I do hope that eventually gamers begin to understand and appreciate that fact.
Alright, so luckily he's done because that was about how much Nintendo fanboy salt I can tolerate at once. Absolutely unreal. Like I said, there's a lot of projection going on, a lot of coping. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, make sure to subscribe. I'm gonna roast some more fanboys. And of course, once the leak mills start running again, when there's new leaks about From Software or if there's news, you best believe I'll cover it. So don't forget to subscribe. I would really appreciate it. And I'll see you guys on the next one.